One more time. Here we go. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Whatever time of day it is, I hope it's good to be where you are, because it is really amazing to be here today. My name is Baltimore Fats, and this is the continuation of Baltimore. Okay, so we're just going to jump right in where we left off, which is with the Sunday Sun of 1906, September 9th, 1906. And they wanted to remind everybody about what the Jubilee of 1880 was, of course, because they're getting ready to throw their Jubilee this week. And what the Jubilee of 1880 was the railroading, for lack of a better word, of the narrative down everybody's throats. And I think this is what was going on all over the place in the latter half of the 19th century, driving the narratives home into the collective unconscious. So what's the new Jubilee going to be? You know, if they had so much narrative to put forth this time, what is it going to be? Well, of course, it's going to be rebirth, and it's going to be about being born into a world of electronic convenience and electric light. And although there was certainly electricity up through and before 1906 in cities, there's electric park even in Baltimore and the trams and so on and so forth. They're really, you know, with this rebuilding of the whole burnt district, which is all going to be modernized for the time, early 1900s, it's going to be a big deal, all right? And they want us to know, and the city's going to be illuminated for Jubilee Week, right? Municipal buildings outlined in electric lights. Business houses will be decorated. And they also have to tell us that the B&O Railroad building, which is going to be, it's like the cornerstone of the rebuilding, right, this building. And it is the most advanced technological marvel of its day at the time for that minute in 1906. And I truly believe it's one of the most important buildings in America, and we'll get to that as we go down the line. But I think it's interesting to note that they decide to tell everybody that the building's not done because they have to, because huge crowds have been gathering. All right, and we'll talk about that in a little bit as well. And so what else do they want to tell us on the Sunday, the eve of the Jubilee? Well, they want to let us know about all the special Thanksgiving services going on, and you better get yourself down to church because everything is now in readiness for the Greater Baltimore Jubilee and Homecoming Week. And you think, well, maybe not everything. And so they published one of these sermons, or excerpts of it anyway, and here it is. And this is from the Reverend Anthony Bilkovsky, right? And I'm going to read the first part of this. It's absolutely amazing. Right? And so he's from the Universalist Church, and his sermon is called Baltimore, the New Jerusalem of the Bible. And it says, in part, it says, the book of Revelation pictures the city as a consummation of the work of man on the earth. The New Jerusalem is represented as coming down from God out of heaven. What does it mean? In the mind of the eternal and the everlasting God, there is a plan for man to follow, an ideal for man to realize. It is man's task to discover what that plan and ideal are, and then to actualize it upon the earth. The race began its life in the wilderness. It shall reach the climax of that life in a city filled with the light and the glory of God. A city into which the nations shall bring their glory and honor. Nothing that maketh an abomination or a lie shall enter into it. Thinking about what Baltimore is today, that line is absolutely hilarious. That is the New Jerusalem of the Bible. The city was not to come down ready-made. The ideal alone is heaven-born. Man is to build the city upon the place of his habitation. Baltimore is the New Jerusalem of the Scriptures. Why? There are 2 billions of people on this planet. Nearly 1/2 of them live in cities, as they could not possibly live in one city. And as a city is the prophetic hope of man, as the Bible points to that hope, it follows that every city that is striving to realize the Bible prophecy is a New Jerusalem. Baltimore is therefore the city spoken of by St. John at Patmos. Baltimore is the phoenix of the 20th century. It has risen out of its ashes, a new creature, instinct with life, filled with undying vitality and resplendent with increased vigor. Baltimore is a miracle of nerve, a marvel of energy, and a prodigy in performance. No other city on earth could have done better, if as well. We have shown that Aladdin and his wonder-working lamp were prefigurations of Baltimoreans. Magic is a prosaic fact. And I'm going to end it there because this sentence is amazing. Magic is a prosaic fact. And let's look up prosaic real quick. And so prosaic means having the style or diction of prose, lacking poetic beauty, dull, dry, humdrum. It's the mundane. It's ubiquitous with society. Magic is everywhere. Magic doesn't mean anything when you have the modern marvels of God and the resplendent and the resplendent rebirth of Baltimore, right? Right? Magic is a prosaic fact. It's just there. Of course there's magic, right? Of course there is. And I love the allusion to Aladdin and his wonder-working lamp, throwing a little Saudi Arabian flavor in there. And so that sermon is absolutely amazing. The rest of it is amazing too, and I'm sure it was even longer. Okay, so what else do they want us to know? What else is happening? And so not only do they talk about you need to get your butts down to church, this article also talks about the parades and everything. And since I'm going to be doing the Jubilee day by day, I'm not going to go over the itinerary here, but it does say something that really propelled this story forward today. Right? I love they still, they have to let everybody know, yeah, if you come downtown, there's still going to be people working. Right? Everything's not quite finished yet, but there are thousands. Visitors are flocking to the cities. Right? Hotels expect to have their hands full. Right? But it says here, Secretary of the Navy Charles J. Bonaparte notified Mayor Mann yesterday of his acceptance of the invitation to view the parades from the windows of the mayor's reception room. I had just learned over the summer that the Bonapartes, an arm of Napoleon's family, settled in Baltimore. Just learned that recently. And so leave it to the Jubilee, of course, to serve up the Bonapartes right on a silver platter for me. And so let's go with the Bonapartes. And Charles here, who I'm going to call Chuck. Because, of course, he's a Charles because there's so many. There's always a Charles. And there's Charleses everywhere. And sure enough, right, he's a lawyer. No. A lawyer? Get out of town. Right? From Baltimore. He serves in the cabinet of the 26th president, who's Theodore Roosevelt. Right? And he gets to be Secretary of the Navy and Attorney General, and he finds the Bureau of Investigation. Napoleon's great-nephew is the founder of the FBI. Look, that was Hoover. And sneaking in there, of course he was. And he's like, it wasn't the FBI until I got my hands on it. That's what Hoover had to say there. So it's so stunning to me. It's absolutely jaw-droppingly amazing that Napoleon's great-nephew had such high-ranking positions within the government and that he started what became the Bureau of Investigation. And we're going to talk about that in a little bit. But let's get to the Bonaparte, shall we? And I'm going to try to be as quick as I can here. So here, of course, the first thing that comes up in his early life is the crest, right? The coat of arms, all right? And I just wanted to point out the knight's helmet here is the same knight helmet, of course, that George Calvert, first Baron of Baltimore, had. There it is. All right, same helmet. So that means the Bonapartes and the Calverts are part of the same Worm Knight family. Whatever branch of whatever, right? They're part of the same one, which is really amazing. I think we're just going to jump right back to the very beginning. He's the son of Jerome Beau Napoleon Bonaparte and Susan May Williams, and we're going to get to them later. And he is the first of the American line of the Bonaparte family descendant. I like the way they phrased that there. Right? And a grandson of Jerome Bonaparte, the youngest brother of Napoleon. And his grandfather, Jerome, here was King of Westphalia. And that's really interesting, and we're going to talk about Jerome in a minute, actually. All right. Of course, he goes on to graduate from Harvard, right, and becomes a lawyer. And so, right, because that's what they all do. They all are lawyers. And one interesting thing that he does is he gives this speech. He's a keynote speaker for the graduating class of the School Sisters of Notre Dame, right, from the College of Notre Dame, and the first graduating class of women, right, of all women. And he gives this speech about the significance of the bachelor's degree. And what he says here is really kind of amazing. And it's interesting that this is the excerpt that the editors or whoever put this this wiki together chose to use. And so having a bachelor's degree implies, in the first place, a broad, generous sympathy with every form of honest, rational, and disinterested study or research. You have to be well-rounded. Learned in all but master of none, I guess, right? That's the bachelor's credo. I just made that up. He may be especially interested in some particular field of knowledge, but he is indifferent to none, meaning you can't rule anything out. You're wise enough in your bachelor's degree to not rule things out, right? You can't be dismissive of things. The holder of the bachelor degree knows how to value every successful effort to master truth, how to look beyond the little things of science, to the great things, God's handiwork as seen in nature, God's mind as shadowed in the workings of the minds of men. This is amazing. If you have a bachelor's degree, you should be smart enough to know what the truth is, and that the truth is not the little things of science. Science provides the little things, but the great things are God's handiwork, or the representations of God through the workings of the minds of men. And so when I first read this and it sat with me for a little while, it made me think of a lot of things, and it made me think about all the Romanesque statuary that's here and all the weird, grotesque creatures I find all over the place around here on buildings everywhere that were built from this period, from after 1880 through to the very early 1930s, that 50-year span. Right? And it made me think, what is that? Is that God's handiwork as seen in nature? Right? Is that what the people were seeing? Because they say it was God's mind. Also, as equally discernible should be God's mind as shadowed in the workings of the minds of men. And so when I look at things like this that I found, look at this guy with his weird head and his seahorse body and his creature for the Black Lagoon hands. Right? And the best part is he's one of a pair. He's flanking this lion, and here's the guy on the other side. And look at these things. What are these things? And of course, they immediately bring to mind the worm creatures that are in the New Earth video. Right? About the worm nights, where I got the whole worm night thing from. It's unbelievable. Right? And so, are those things, is this what's real? Are men's mind interpreting that as God in nature? Or was that really God in nature? That's what that kind of made me think of. I don't know why. Right? And he lives in a townhouse in the Mount Vernon Belvedere area. And he also has a country estate. This one here, the Bella Vista. Now, the interesting thing is, of course, he lives in Mount Vernon Belvedere. Because in Mount Vernon Belvedere, that's where I found this guy. Right? The ball figure that I use for my avatar. And so he lives here as well. And it's very interesting that, and this is a picture they saved in 1907, it says, but it's very interesting that it says that the house was never electrified, since Bonaparte refused to have electricity or telegraph lines installed from a dislike of technology, verified by his use of horse-drawn coach until his death in the early 1920s. And now that's really interesting. Was he really a technophobe? Or was the worm night blood strong enough in him that the vibrations that the technology brought on bothered him? And he was getting ready to go underground anyway. I don't know. It's just amazing that the narrative wants to bring me that way, that the paradigm being spun out of Baltimore is that. So let's get into his family before we get into his career with the FBI and the government, right? And so we'll start with his grandfather, who was the brother of Napoleon, all right? And because I know... And so let's talk about the family for a minute. Right? I don't really know much about the Napoleons, or about the Bonapartes rather, but just basic bullet points that I remember from the remedial high school history, right? That he was Emperor of France. He took it over in a military coup after the Revolution. He had an unsuccessful campaign in Russia. He lost it all at Waterloo, that kind of thing, right? And, of course, the things that he loves water slides from Bill and Ted. And so the Bonapartes, I didn't realize they were of Italian origin. They were a dynasty from Italy, all right? Come from these Carlo Buonaparte. Bonaparte. So I didn't know, right? I didn't realize that. So that's kind of interesting that an Italian dynastic family would be the ruler of this French empire. And so we're going to start with Jerome, Napoleon's brother, who is the grandfather of our boy Chuck. And so he, of course, has a life of privilege, being the brother of Napoleon, and he gets to go to a nice elite private Catholic school, and he gets government, he gets political positions and things like that. He is even king of Westphalia, which I don't know if I mentioned or not, was at one time the seat of the Holy Roman Empire. So it's got to be a pretty important seat in Napoleon's vast empire of most of the continental Europe. and so, as I was saying, he goes to college, but on Christmas Eve 1803, he marries, as a 19-year-old, he marries this Elizabeth Betsy Patterson, the 18-year-old daughter of a prosperous ship owner and merchant, William Patterson, from where? From Baltimore, right? And so what they're saying is that a noble Italian dynastic bloodline and a noble dynastic bloodline that is on the throne in England, or the rightful king of England, whatever his last name is. So we got a Bonaparte and the heir of the English throne marrying women from Baltimore. What is that all about? And the women from Baltimore got their mojo working. And they must, because these people are all supposed to marry European aristocratic noble bloodlines. They're not supposed to be marrying American women. And so after he marries her, what happens is he must have gotten her pregnant, because they're heading back to Europe, and Napoleon balks at the marriage. He doesn't want his brother married here. He wants his brother to marry, of course, some other European bloodline. And he blocks them from coming in. He tries to get the Pope to annul the marriage. The Pope won't do it. So, being emperor, he just says, I'm going to do it myself. Right? So, by imperial decree, he annuls the marriage. And he races to his brother to try to convince him to let him stay married to Elizabeth. But that doesn't work. And so, Elizabeth cannot enter the European mainland. And she goes to England, where she gives birth to their son. And so he goes off to be a French aristocrat and politician and king of Westphalia, and she goes back to Maryland with her son. All right, so here we go with Jerome, right? Beau, to his friends and family, right? And of course, since his parents can't be together, right, she gets shipped back here. He's the bastard son of Napoleon's brother, being raised on a vast Maryland plantation. And that qualifies him to be chairman of the Maryland Agricultural Society, right, and president of the first Maryland Club, which is a very exclusive club, right? And I think it's interesting that they had to make note here that it's speculated that his prospective title is the reason that there was this proposed Titles of Nobility amendment to the Constitution, which fails by only 2 votes. It failed by, that means it was hotly contested at the time. Right, because he is a prince. He is in succession to the throne of Westphalia, I guess, at some point. So he's allowed to maintain his title, but they don't use it in America, of course. Right, because allegedly he has no political power or sway in America, or that imperial family doesn't anyway. Right, of course not. No. And so he does what they all do as well, right? He goes to law school at Harvard, right? That paves the way for his son, right? And becomes a lawyer, right? And then in 1829, he marries Susan May Williams, who, of course, is another heiress from Baltimore. So if you're keeping score, the score is now 2 Bonapartes to 1 whatever King Edward's last name is. 2-1. Dynastic bloodlines marrying Baltimore women. It's just unbelievable. And so he has 2 children, And one of them is, of course, our boy Chuck. And so let's move right on over to Chuck. And so now, we've just discussed his life a little bit, and that he was, of course, a lawyer like all the rest of them, and who his family is a little bit. And so now let's get into his time served as U.S. Secretary of the Navy, the Attorney General, and the creation of the Bureau of Investigation. Because this is amazing. Roosevelt respects him enough, and ignores his imperial pedigree. Of course, it's all earned by achievement in America. He earns all of this, right, through all his lawyering and going to Harvard. He gets to be U.S. Secretary of the Navy with no military experience at all. And then Attorney General, which is like one of the most important seats in the American government. And he's asked to create the Bureau of Investigation by Roosevelt. So let's look at that. It's just amazing that somebody with this bloodline connection, so close, firstborn in America, in Baltimore, of this Bonaparte royal family. It's interesting that they say they were never considered part of the dynasty. Of course not in America. And I can only imagine Chuck here growing up, but Dad, you're a prince. Shh, be quiet. Don't ruin it. We're grooming you. You are not a prince. You are not a prince. He had to be hypnotized. And so it's just amazing. I cannot get over this. And again, they can't hide it. It happened. But, I don't believe this is stuff this is the angles that they want really looked at, investigated, for lack of a better word, right? And so we're just going to jump right to the beginning and try to get through this as quick as I can too. And we'll go right to the background in the creation. All right, so it's the late 1880s, right? We're getting ready for the turn of the 20th century. And the 20th century is where they're really going to step it up. They're really going to crack down on the populations, these booming populations that they've nurtured for the last 40 years, all of these immigrants, right? They've set it all up for them with their industry. And they've told everybody what to expect and what their history was. Right? They got everybody in line for them to flick the switch. And it starts, they created the National Bureau of Criminal Identification. And it was to identify criminals. But then in 1901, there was the assassination of President McKinley, which I'm not going to get into today. But they say that the perception was after his assassination that America was under threat by anarchists. Gee, that story doesn't sound familiar. That doesn't sound familiar at all. And so there's these agencies like the National Bureau of Criminal Identification lying around. Roosevelt says, we need to do something about all these anarchists. So, Charlie, you're in charge. And he hires a bunch of Secret Service agents, and he creates his Department of Investigation. It's very interesting, of course, because he was a political activist for progressive and liberal causes. We're going to see, there's very little difference from 1906 to today and to modern times as to what progressive and liberal causes are. What are the effects of these progressive and liberal causes? And should somebody who champions such progressive and liberal causes be put in charge of a Bureau of Investigation? So let's explore this, right? Because this is all important, the way it ties together. So what was the first thing as an official Bureau of Investigation chartered by Congress in 1908? What was their first official task? And that was to make surveys in preparation for the enforcement of the White Slave Traffic Act, or Mann Act, which had passed on June 25th, 1910. And so their first couple years, they're gathering intelligence on the white slave. And this was done under the auspices of the Mann Act. And so we're going to talk a little bit about the Mann Act and what the Mann Act really did, right? And what the Mann Act really does is it legislates morality, right? It makes it a felony in interstate or foreign commerce transport of any woman or girl for the purpose of prostitution or debauchery or for any other immoral purpose. All right, of course, the law is to stop the human trafficking. Of course, that's what the law isn't to legislate your morality. it's to stop human trafficking, right? But the act itself, the Mann Act, is only one of several acts of protective legislation aimed at moral reform during the progressive era. And its ambiguous language allows it, and its ambiguous language about what immorality is results in the in the act to being used to criminalize consensual sexual behavior between adults. And that's the key word, consensual. Consensual. Right? They are legislating morality, creating and telling you what is right and wrong to do under the auspices of something that is really, of course, horribly wrong in human trafficking. But of course, because the other side of that is there is consensual aspects of this. There is consensual prostitution. There was consensual indentured servitude. Right? These things they happened, right? And it still probably happens. It happens today because we are in consensual servitude to our governments by having our security numbers and paying taxes. You know, I mean, it's consensual. Right? And they make it so it has to be so, right? And that they're certainly continuing to try to do that. And it's amazing that the Mann Act stays unamended until the late 70s and early 80s to make it sure that it's only about the human trafficking and not about other immoral activities. So it's amazing that the first act of the Bureau of Investigation is to, survey and enforce this Mann Act, which essentially legislates your morality, tells you what you can and can't do, what's right and wrong in terms of your sexuality. And it's so unbelievably amazing that comes from Chuck Bonaparte, right? Who the progressive liberal. So we have the enforcement of the Mann Act happening, and he's in charge of that. But he's also the founder and president of the National Municipal League. And let's look at the National Municipal League, which is now the National Civic League, right? It's a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization, and of course it is, right? Because nonpartisan means everybody's involved, and nonprofit means no one's getting paid. Yeah, right. Yeah, no one's getting paid. And what it does is it promotes the professional management of local government through the publication of model charters for both city and county governments. So it essentially tells city and county governments what to do, because they don't know what to do, these local officials, right? They need guidance, right? And what better guidance can they get than the National Civic League? And they apply civic engagement principles through their programs of community assistance, their research, right? They give out awards and stuff. But here we go with what they do. So it's founded by Roosevelt and these other noted prominent people, along with our boy Chuck, right? And in 1898, they developed the first municipal plan to give more power and autonomy to local officials, more power to be controlled privately, right? Through their league. It's unbelievable, right? So they spread this form of government all over the place where they can. And I'm sure not every city that adopts it takes credit for adopting it. They keep it on the down low, on the hush-hush. And so they're pretty active until about, nearest the First World War. At least they don't put out much, right? But they're pumping out, I guess they would be pumping out issues of their review. And in 1930, they acted as the premier civic engagement group, researching, advocating, and publishing and consulting on civic engagement applications like voter registration, election administration, and state constitutions. Here we go, circling the wagons or tightening the noose. However, yeah, I guess tightening the noose is even better. But seizing control of the voting process, the National Civic League does in 1930. And then World War II comes around, and right as the baby boom is getting into full swing, they surface with their All-American City contest, where they name 10 cities as All-American cities, and the annual tradition of the All-American football player starts, of course, and that's ubiquitous with sports today, everywhere. So, boom, we got the population explosion, the baby boom coming in after the war, and they let that flourish. They say, they let all of that happen, and of course they have the CIA and the other things going on, and they're creating the counterculture through all their secret programs, right? And with all the riots and the counterculture and everything, right? And so in 1980, they begin research and education on to advance civic infrastructure. And what does that mean? That means that's the cities of the future. What are we going to do with this perfect mess that we've made, right? So in they take a decade and they spearhead the civic renewal movement, right? And so that's the end result of their research and education from 1980 to 1990. And I think this is interesting because just within my own memory, remembering certainly New York, which was the closest big city I would have been around in the very early 80s. In the 80s, it still was like, it had like a nasty reputation, right? Manhattan had, like, Times Square was all peep shows and strip clubs and drugs, real seedy stuff, right? And Brooklyn was all gangs and street toughs, like the Sweat Hogs. And Vegas was that way too. And then in 1990, that's when you start to see the turn of these places. That's when New York really starts to cleaning itself up in the 90s and starting to transform Manhattan and Brooklyn into certainly Manhattan is the adult playground, and Brooklyn is really now being upper class. The same in Vegas and in other major cities that are going to be strongholds for our controllers. And even in 2000, they strengthened their focus on the issues such as the environment, racial equity, immigrant integration, transportation, fiscal sustainability, which is just hilarious to me. Because they're fiscal sustainability in a world of fiat currency. And it just makes me shake my head at that the Civic League could be doing this for 118 years with so little progress made, right? With such noble ambitions, If their ambitions were so noble, how come there's so little progress being made? What is happening here with these issues? Because immigration is still a major factor today. And, I'm not going to tell anybody what to think politically or anything like that. But, the problem is from both sides. There's no doubt about it. But there's a certain level of ignorance going on when the progressive liberals have controlled the mechanisms for local government going back until the very earliest part of the 20th century. And it's unbelievable that this type of government control was spearheaded by Napoleon's great nephew. There's no coincidence. It's unbelievable. And so that's where I'm going to end this one. Right? It just boggles my mind that societal control is played out this way through the Bonapartes, through Baltimore, and 2 more women marrying royal bloodlines out of Baltimore. It is just absolutely crazy. So I hope you had as much fun with this one as I did. And until the next one, cheers, guys.